All right, are we?
We're going live in a second, it looks like.
Okay, you guys are now live.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We are going to do Maryland Realtors Legal Hotline live session for probably about an hour or so. Everybody, I think everyone knows all of us. I'm Kathleen D'Artez. Everyone knows Colette and Colette Massingale, Mark Feinroth, and the newest attorney on our team is Reese Lesko, who just joined us shortly before this all exploded. So welcome aboard, Reese. What we're going to do this afternoon, we have, as you all can imagine, we've had a ton of questions recently about the COVID-19 virus and how it affects transactions. So that's going to be primarily the focus of this. And we wanted to start off just talking a little bit about the executive orders and kind of how we are and where we are. And then kind of just to break it down and sort of more or less walk through a transaction, start talking about listings, open houses, showings, and then move into the contracts themselves, and situations that are coming up as a result of the virus, and then move on and talk about settlements and recordings, and then maybe a little bit of time for some property management, landlord tenant, and Mark's going to talk about some real estate commission matters, licensing extensions, and some of the state and federal programs that are out there. So that is a lot to talk about, and not a lot of time. So we'll try and we might have to be brief on some of these things and more of an overview. You can submit questions on Facebook. Sandy Frazier, or in our communications guy, Dan, is going to be monitoring those questions, and they'll submit them to us. So we're going to try and keep focused on those particular topics. If we have extra time at the end, we can broaden and go into other things as well. So that's the plan. All right, so first, you guys probably have read and heard about executive orders more in the past 2 or 3 weeks than you have in your lifetime. The state of emergency, I guess Governor Hogan has issued a series of executive orders. And the first executive order that was issued did not include residential real estate as an essential service. And then there's been a lot of action in a very short time here. The underlying guidance that Governor Hogan had incorporated is guidance from Homeland Security. It's the CISA guidance. And that was modified over a weekend. And then the governor issued a revised order. So residential real estate is now considered an essential service. So that's one part of the equation. The second part of the equation, though, is obviously the governor, the administration, all of us here in Maryland, all of us at Maryland Realtors, we're all trying to minimize the risk of spreading this virus. And the next executive order that was issued was a stay-at-home order. A lot of businesses were closed down. Even essential businesses had to change the way they operated in order to try to reduce the spread of the virus and to protect all of us, protect our clients, our families, our communities. So that's kind of what the issue has been, I guess, at least initially, balancing the fact that residential real estate is an essential service, but also that people are subject to stay-at-home orders, and we're supposed to be trying to minimize in-person contact as much as possible. So as you guys are aware, obviously this is going to affect your business and affect our industry. And we've been working, our government affairs people, we've been working with the administration and trying to make sure we're all on the same page and make sure that we have come up with best practices that allow you to do your business and to continue to do business, but to do it in a way that is safe and doesn't jeopardize your health, your family's health, or your client's health. So those are probably the most important executive orders. There is one other one that was put in place just this week. It was an executive order where the governor delegated to the local health officials, like to the county health department, the ability to enforce violations. If there's a business that's violating these stay-at-home orders, or even essential businesses that are operating improperly, non-essential businesses that are operating in a way they should not be operating, local health officials have been delegated with the authority to control and close unsafe facilities. So that's the newest twist on this equation. And honestly, we've heard a couple instances about that already, some actions taken by the local county health officials. And our government affairs people are working with some of them as well to make sure we have certainty and clarity on that. The bottom line, I think basically the effect of all of these executive orders is we want to allow you to continue to do business. The governor wants to allow you to continue to do business, but we can't do business in a risky or unsafe way. So that's really the balancing act that we've all got to monitor as we move forward through this process. I'm just going to start, I guess, with listings and showings. And I know that a lot of you have already modified your policies and your practices. These really the balancing act that we've all got to. It is definitely a balancing act, yeah. And it's going to continue to be a balancing act. There's every issue that comes up, you're going to have to balance both sides and see what's the safest way to do things. And, you don't want to put anybody at risk, including yourself. So let's just start with listings. That's sort of a relatively easy one. I think everyone by now, you guys all have DocuSign and electronic contracts and dot loop and all these ability to exchange documents and sign documents electronically. That obviously will help, and that's going to be expanded even more. If you're meeting with a seller, the seller might have some concerns about listing their property, specifically about showings and open houses and who's going to come into their property. They want to basically, most of them want to limit access to the property. And what is a way to do that? They want to sell their home, obviously, but they don't want 200 people trotting through their home and potentially exposing their family to the virus. So our best recommendation really for listings or any showings in reality, our best recommendation is really wherever possible, try and do virtual showings, virtual listings, do everything in a way that avoids in-person contact wherever possible. I know that's not always possible. I know that some buyers are not going to purchase a home that they haven't been. I absolutely positively understand that. So Maryland Realtors issued guidance as well. We spoke with the Hogan administration. We spoke with the brokers, had a broker summit and got some input together to provide best practices. The best advice, of course, to minimize in-person contact as much as possible. If you're going to do something in person, the recommendations are that all of those in-person meetings be by appointment only, obviously to protect everyone's health, and no more than 3 people present in the home at one time, and that's including the agent. So if a property is listed for sale, the seller is going to allow in-person showings. You're working with the buyers. I don't know if the buyers want to bring over their mother, their cousin, their best friend, their neighbor. The best practice would be not to do that. You want to limit the showing and just have the agent, maybe if there's 2 buyers, just them attend. That would be the best practice. I think so far we've had good feedback on that. I think that's working out for people. Let me see, open houses, generally the recommendation I think is not to do open houses. Not to do open houses in the traditional way, I should say. Virtual open houses. You can certainly do a virtual open house. You could talk with your client, the seller client, and you can bring a videographer in. That's a related service. That's one of the residential real estate services. That's permissible. The seller could authorize you to create a listing video. You could have a photographer come in and do a listing video, and you can share that however you want to share that. That could be an open house. You can share that on Bright MLS. They've modified their rules a little bit. You are allowed to show those listing videos. I believe if it's branded, you can show the link in the agent remarks. If it's unbranded, you can show the link in the consumer remarks. So everyone would be able to see that listing video and see it that way. I know that you guys are all entrepreneurs and very creative. I saw someone had set up an open house last Sunday, a virtual open house. I should give credit to Tering Wang for this idea, but she set up a virtual open house using Eventbrite and invited people to attend. There were some photos of the home, set it up for a particular time on Sunday afternoon, and people registered through Eventbrite, and they were there. They were able to answer questions live in an interactive way. So this is an opportunity for you to get creative, I guess, and to do things in like I said, a creative way, entrepreneurial way to still service and support your clients and go all out and try and help them sell their home, buy a home, but do so in a safe way. So that I would say for listings is probably one good thing. Open houses can be virtual. Broker opens, again, no one's going to be doing broker opens in person right now. But again, here's another opportunity to be creative. You could do virtual broker opens too, I suppose. You could have several houses that might be listed, maybe within your company with other brokers, and do them all on the same day. Have video tours of each. Again, a virtual brokers open. An idea that we had talked about, I know at Brokers Open, a lot of times you've got the great food, you've got the local deli or whatever spread out there. Maybe do a virtual version of that as well. Maybe provide gift certificates to a local coffee shop or a local restaurant or bookstore or whatever it might be. You know, they're all struggling and they all could use some business too. So that again could be a creative way for you to do something virtually and still support other businesses, maybe contacts you have through your networking groups or just, you know, cool restaurants in the neighborhood that people would like to go to if they move in. Showings, I guess, are kind of another issue. The same guidance would apply for showings if possible. Virtual showing is recommended or preferred. The buyer's agent, I guess you could speak to the listing agent. If they will allow you to come into the property, you could use FaceTime or whatever video conferencing mechanism or program or app or whatever it is that you use. You could walk around the home, discuss it with your client, answer questions, show them whatever it is, do it that way. Again, if the seller is allowing in-person showings and your buyer wants to do an in-person showing, we would again caution that obviously should be by appointment only, no more than 3 people in the property. And again, of course, follow the CDC guidelines. You want to keep your social distancing, your 6-foot distance from people. And of course, you want the seller to practice good hygiene or provide a hand sanitizer for people to use and make sure everyone washes their hands. If they have booties available, that would be good. I don't know if people have masks or want to wear masks. That would, I guess, would be up to the individuals. I think it's tough to come up with masks. I'm not sure that everyone would have those. There's a bunch of FAQs and practices posted on the Maryland Realtor website, also on the NAR website about this kind of thing. Some recommendations you probably wouldn't think about in a normal situation, but if you're really just trying to think about, you want to minimize the opportunities for people's hands to be touching things, right? So leave doors open, leave the lights turned on, maybe leave the cabinet doors open so people can see around without having to physically touch the doors, touch the handles, and turn the lights on and off. Just some sort of practical things like that, I guess, for showings. What else? Are there any questions so far? Anything I should discuss that I haven't mentioned yet?
Kathleen, there is a question that did come in.
Okay.
It says, what suggestions do you have for new homeowners whom are looking to get pre-approved with the new restrictions on credit scores now?
I do not have any information on that. Does that Colette or Reese, do you have any information on that?
What the question is, what
credit scores?
It says, what suggestions do you have for new homeowners whom are looking to get pre-approved with new restrictions on credit scores now?
I mean, they can proceed to try to get pre-approved. I mean, as Kathleen said, the goal in all this is to minimize risk and try to balance things, but it's not prohibiting anybody from, you know, buying property. So they can try to proceed and just make sure that they're using best practices and doing what they can to minimize risk.
Start early.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's a good point, Mark. I think throughout this entire process now, everyone should anticipate that there probably are going to be some delays. Things are just going to take longer than they normally would. A lot of companies are working on they're short-staffed or skeleton crews, or a lot of people may have been laid off. We have talked, I know someone had a challenge obtaining financing. The underwriting department was closed for a couple of weeks, so that was going to delay some things. So actually, this is probably a good transition into Colette's part of the presentation and talk about some of the contract issues, because those are the kind of questions that we've been having, where there are some delays that might come up, and how do the parties deal with those? So Colette, you want to start talking about that?
Yeah. So, and actually, just to kind of piggyback on what you and Mark are saying, I think NAR's guidance is to really have a conversation with the buyer and the seller about potential delays. And that kind of leads right into the new Maryland Realtors COVID-19 addendum to the contract of sale, which is, I think, pretty straightforward in terms of just making sure that buyer and seller are aware that there could be delays in any part of the transaction, from trying to obtain a loan to having inspections. And so the parties will want to consider incorporating that COVID-19 addendum to the contract of sale into their transaction. There's options there for the parties to consider, 30 days or 60 days or 90 days out. And the timeframes, I think what works well about the addendum is all the timeframes where the parties have the ability to modify all the timeframes in the contract, not just the settlement date, not just the financing application date. So you want to definitely take a look at that addendum, share it with the parties, and have them consider incorporating that and be mindful of potential delays, again, throughout all parts of the transaction. One of the questions that we've received on the hotline is whether or not this new Maryland Realtors COVID-19 addendum is required or mandated by law. It is not, but it is, again, a good idea to have the parties consider incorporating it so that they've talked about it, prior to anything actually happening, and there is the ability to address delays if they come about. So that's one question that we've had. Another one is there a particular time frame that Maryland Realtors recommends a buyer and seller agree to in that addendum? I believe it's paragraph 2 of the addendum that talks about the party's ability to extend the time frame 30 days, 60 days, or they can insert a time frame. It really is going to depend on what's happening in the transaction. So we don't have any particular or specific time frame that the parties should consider. So they'll have to kind of work it out based on the facts and circumstances of that particular transaction, what caused that delay. Another question that we've had is, or scenario that we've been presented with, is one where the parties are actually already under contract. It's a cash deal. All the contingencies have been satisfied. And here we are with a buyer's income having been impacted by this pandemic. They're actually asking the seller to sign the Maryland Realtors COVID-19 addendum because it wasn't part of the initial transaction, and the seller is refusing to sign it. So what are the buyer's options there? Of course, our suggestion was to, try to urge the seller, go back to the seller and again say, look, if we want to kind of keep this deal alive, consider reviewing the addendum and signing it so that we can move forward. Perhaps the parties could agree to extend the settlement date out a little bit to enable the buyer to consider how they're going to sort of deal with their income and hopefully proceed to settlement. So that was kind of our stance there. Another scenario that we were presented with is buyer and seller use Maryland contract, the Maryland Realtors contract. The transaction is in fact contingent on financing, and the buyer's income has changed because of the epidemic. So what are the buyer's options there? Well, I think paragraph 9, of course, you've got the addendum, potentially can change those timeframes, but the addendum, the contract, paragraphs 9 and 10 essentially say that the buyer is not able to get the financing. They've done everything that they could possibly do under the financing contingency, the buyer responsibility provision, but they are not able ultimately to obtain financing. Then the contract stipulates that the buyer can send over a notice basically of termination accompanied by a denial letter from the lender. And if, again, buyer has done everything they are required to do under the terms of the contract, then the release deposit agreement should indicate that the buyer would get their deposit back. So that is dealt with in the contract. Another scenario that we've gotten is, of course, with a concern about how this virus spreads, and every day we're kind of getting new information. Buyer in this scenario was concerned about germs spreading about the property, and we're wondering what could they obligate the seller to do. Now, there's always the ability of the parties to modify the terms of the contract at any point. If a buyer, for example, submits a request to say, hey, look, seller, can you clean X, Y, and Z, sterilize, whatever you want to do, the seller can agree to that request, and then that new request would become part of the contract. But if the seller doesn't agree with a request of that nature to change the existing terms of the contract, then we would say paragraph 22 of the contract, which is the property condition and possession paragraph of the contract, would be controlling. And what does that obligate the seller to do? To convey the property broom clean and substantially the same condition as existed on the date of contract acceptance. But again, we're dealing with this time, and if there is a request like that that comes from the buyer, the seller can certainly consider it and decide whether or not they want to agree with it. If they agree with it, it should be in writing, and then it would become part of the contract. If they don't agree with it, then the underlying terms of the contract would remain in full force and effect. And then finally, another question that has cropped up is, what about with these delays? Suppose the seller can't get the disclosures under the HOA Act or the condo to the buyers, or any ability to modify the time frame for getting those disclosures. Now, the statute does not allow any modifications to any aspect of the HOA or Condo Act. So essentially, both acts preclude the parties from contractually modifying those timeframes. So that's just kind of a sprinkling of some of the questions that we've been getting as it regards the contract, the transaction itself. Anybody want to add anything?
Colette, I was just going to say one thing. You and I had talked about this when drafting that addendum. I think sometimes the seller may think, or I guess the party who's not requesting the extension or not needing the extension, there's some concern that the other party might just be using this as sort of a get out of jail free card. How do I know that the other party really has a COVID-19 crisis or a real legitimate reason to ask for this extension? Or are they just trying to take advantage? And what kind of, should we make them provide supporting documentation, or how do I know that, there's really been an issue like that? Colette and I had talked about that when when she was preparing the addendum. And I was going to say, we decided not to require that, just because I think in reality, people are going to have challenges. Like we said, their offices are on short staff or skeleton staffs. And I know that something came up with HUD yesterday. I think HUD is backed up 2 weeks in responding to questions. So there are going to be delays. So we thought there might be challenges in providing documentation. But I think we would just suggest, as a practical matter, if you're the buyer and you're going to have delays in getting your financing approved, and you want to use the COVID-19 addendum to extend, to bump out some of the deadlines, if you're the buyer's agent, you want to make this request attractive to the seller. You want to, how can I help make it easy for the seller to accept this and agree to it? So I would, of course, suggest we would suggest if you have any documentation, if you have emails from the lender saying, hey, we're not going to get a chance, we're backed up by 2 weeks, certainly submit that. You certainly can submit documentation voluntarily. I think if you're the party requesting the extension, obviously that'll help show that it's a legitimate request. There's a real reason for doing this. I'm not just trying to, to get out of jail free or get over on the other parties. That would just be, I think, a practical suggestion. Submit it if you have it, but we didn't want to make that a requirement because just reality, it may be difficult to get documentation sometimes.
And thank you, Kathleen, for adding that important point. And then the other thing is the parties should also be aware that there is embodied in any contractual agreement an implied obligation that the parties act in good faith. And so you may want to just share that with buyer and seller so they know, there is an obligation to act in good faith to ensure that the terms of the contract ultimately satisfied.
All right.
So that's some of this sort of questions that we've been getting on that point. Do you want to go over what's the next topic that we had there?
Next, we're going to talk about closing and settlements, I guess, if we're ready to move on to that.
Yep,
Yeah.
I'm ready. Hello, everybody. This is Reese. I'm going to talk about courthouses, recordings, settlements, and remote online notarization. So first thing that we'll talk about is the courthouses. We all know that some of the courthouses are closed to the public or operating as a skeleton crew, but that will not really affect your real estate settlements. Most jurisdictions utilize Simplifile, and if you're not familiar with that, that is where the title company can electronically transfer the documents from the settlement, the deed of trust, anything for recording directly to the courthouse. A lot of the individuals that work at the courthouse have remote online access now, so they can review your deeds of trust, send it back to the title company if it needs correction, or go ahead and approve it so it can appear in the land records. I know some people were concerned about how it would hold up your transaction, and it really shouldn't hold up your transaction at all. Most counties, whether they're closed or not, are still operating and being able to record those documents. The one thing that I will let you know is that there are some documents that are originals, such as the powers of attorney that are used in a real estate settlement. The title company does need the original, and it does need to be recorded immediately prior to the deed and deed of trust that it's used upon. Those original documents do get returned back to you, but that could possibly be delayed in the transaction. Also, if the property tends to be, it's unimproved land, or somebody is seeking to build on the land and they need building permits, or something similar to that where they need to appear as the record owner on SDAT, there's a chance that that could potentially be delayed of them showing as the record owner on SDAT. But the majority of things, such as school districts or anything like that, you can show a copy of the deed, and the title company can give you a copy of that. They get a copy of the electronic recording in Simplifile, and they would be able to provide that to you. Next, I want to talk about settlements. Settlements are occurring, and your expert on that is going to be the title company that is closing your particular transaction. So if you have a settlement going in Anne Arundel County and also a settlement going in PG County, and you have two different title companies, you want to speak to the title company for that actual transaction. Because even if a title company is a mile apart, they're going to be handling it differently, and they're going to have different resources and different procedures in place. Some title companies are doing drive up kind of closings where they have the seller on one side of the parking lot, buyer on the other side. They're giving you the documents, allowing you to sign them in your vehicle. Some are having different tents set up so you can go to the particular tent, sign. They are sanitizing all of the facilities. They're taking the pens, throwing them away, doing gloves, masks, doing everything that they can to keep you safe. So you really want to talk to the title company and see what sort of procedures that they have in place. I've also heard of title companies that are utilizing FaceTime in order to explain the documents in advance, so that way when the sellers or buyers come and they're doing the signing in their vehicle or at one of the tables outside, or however the procedure they have set up, you're already familiar with the documents, so you spend less time with them at the table. So that's an option that could be available to you as well. So you really want to check with your title company and see what services are available and what procedures they've set up. I know that they're all working very hard to keep your clients safe and to be accommodating in the current environment that we are. And then the last thing I want to talk about is the remote online notarization. We all know that on March 30th, Governor Hogan put a executive order in to temporarily waive the in-person notarization. But I want to advise you all that that's not necessarily a quick fix. And the reason that is because if you read through the executive order, someone who is a valid notary, they have to be already a valid notary. They have to email the Secretary of State and let them know that what platform they are going to be utilizing. Some of those platforms are Doc Verify or Notarize, and they have to let them know which platform they're going to be utilizing. FaceTime is not an approved service for this. Sometimes you hear people saying, oh, they did a closing over. FaceTime, that is not okay. When I recommend you go watch some of the videos that are available on these platforms. You can go on to Notarize, watch a YouTube video that explains it. The most important thing about these platforms that are available is the ability to do a lot of identification, verification. So it has the ability to take a photo of the passport or the driver's license and upload that, and also gives the seller or buyer, they can put in information such as their current address and the last 4 of their social. And then there'll be some challenge questions that generate based off of the information that's provided, such as where did they go to college, what other streets have they lived on, what sort of employers they've had, in order for them to qualify themselves as actually being the person who they claim to be. And that platform will let you know if they passed the certification or not, so that you can proceed with the transaction. Some other things to keep in mind is that obviously some of the title companies may not have already been up on these platforms. And a lot of the platforms state that it takes 2 to 3 weeks for onboarding whenever a title company signs up with that particular platform. Also for lenders also have to be signed up with these platforms to deliver the packages through them. And the onboarding for that takes about 3 to 4 weeks for that onboarding process. So there are some things that the title companies have to do. It's not an immediate fix. They have to work with their underwriters and determine what the underwriters are requiring them to do. Most underwriters now are requiring an additional verbiage to be on the title binder that goes to the lender regarding the remote notarization. And the title companies also need to check whether their E&O insurance actually allows them to do remote notarization. So, so although it's a step forward, it's not 100% quick fix. But I can tell you these title companies are working very hard to make your transactions run smooth. So just get in contact with them as early as you can. And the Maryland Land Title Association also has been trying to post as much as they can, just as we have been trying to post as much as we can to give you the most up-to-date information. So Maryland Land Title will be able to update you on courthouses, on different notary requirements as they apply to your settlements and the title companies that are out there. And that is all I have for right now, unless there's any questions.
Reese, no questions about that, but I did post, we are going to post that link for the remote notaries, so that'll be on Facebook as well.
Okay, great.
All right. I was going to go ahead and talk, I guess, now about this is going to be the one where everybody's going to have a lot of questions, and we don't have a lot of answers, to be perfectly honest. Property management or landlord-tenant situation. There's been sort of an excuse me, an ebb and flow of these questions. I think 10 days ago we were getting a lot of questions about whether real estate was essential or non-essential. Are we essential or non-essential? Excuse me. Now that that's been resolved, it seems like this week, over the past couple of days, a very hot topic has been a landlord-tenant situation. And the most common question I guess we're getting right now is if the landlord wants to show the property. I think most of you guys are aware that in the lease, typically the tenant signs, there's a provision in the lease that is signed by the landlord and the tenant, where the landlord has the right to show the property for some period of time before the termination of the lease, 30 days, 60 days, whatever it is, if the landlord wants to rent the property to somebody else, or if the landlord wants to sell the property. That's pretty common that that's included in a lease template. I think most of the leases include that verbiage. So in a normal situation, that's not really that much of an issue. Occasionally you have a tenant who's uncooperative or whatever, but you can sort of work around that and deal with that. However, in the current situation, some tenants are adamant that they do not want to cooperate in allowing the landlord to do showings. They don't want strangers trotting through their property. They're concerned obviously about catching the virus or someone spreading the virus. So this, of course, is causing conflicts. And we've had questions and concerns from both sides, people who represent landlords, people who represent tenants. Just so you all know, I think this is just not isolated to Maryland. It's not just solely a Maryland issue. As part of, the Maryland Realtors, we have access to various resources through the National Association of Realtors. And this has been a very hot topic on all of those listservs and all those platforms as well for the past couple of days. A few states have dealt with this in a more clear-cut manner. I think the states that have dealt with this most readily, there's been some additional guidance, maybe from the Attorney General or someone from the state saying, I think it was Washington State, I believe, was one of them, where the Attorney General issued a statement saying that the landlord cannot require an in-person showing of tenant-occupied property. Basically, the tenant can refuse and say, "I will not allow the landlord to show the property during the time while this crisis is going on." So some states, it's more clear, and the guidance is readily available. Maryland, to date, we do not have that kind of clear-cut guidance. Like we just said, in the lease, generally, the landlord is supposed to give the tenant notice. We're going to show the property, Thursday afternoon at 1. We're going to show it Saturday afternoon. The tenant is supposed to, what's the phrase in the lease? The tenant is supposed to make reasonable accommodations to comply. So that really is kind of what the issue is now. And I think especially from the tenant side, is it reasonable to require the tenant or expect the tenant to allow their home to be opened up to a variety of people or a stream of people coming in and coming out? So again, it's kind of, in all honesty, we don't have an answer right now. Maryland Realtors, you guys know, we have a bunch of different departments. We all have partners in the industry, like Reese was just talking about Maryland Land Title Association. We have relationships with the administration. We have relationships with property management companies and large property management companies. So we're reaching out behind the scenes to try and see if we can develop some best practices or guidance on that. Or maybe get some additional guidance from, I don't know if it'd be the Attorney General, whoever it would be, somebody within the administration. Right now, I think the same guidance would prevail. If there is a way to do a virtual showing of the property, that's obviously the way to go. I don't know that tenants have the ability to walk around with their iPhone and do a FaceTime video, that's going to be sufficient to show for someone to give them a good feel for the property. It may be something the landlord would talk to the tenant. Maybe the tenant would be okay with letting the realtor in, or a professional photographer or professional videographer, if they agree to follow CDC protocols or whatever, and then they could have one video that they could utilize to show to potential tenants or potential buyers. That might be one way around it. So that could work. Right now, though, it's really a balancing act. I mean, in general, like I said, the landlord would have the right to show the property. The tenant could not block that or refuse to cooperate. Right now, I think it's a different world right now, and I think we should be careful. We should respect the rights of the tenant, but also we have to respect the rights of the landlord as well. And we have heard some bad stories, of course. There are landlords, maybe there's tenants who have brought unauthorized people into the property. They brought, the lease says there's going to be 3 people living in the property, and they've brought in some strays. So there's other people living in the property, and maybe they're not taking good care of the property, and the landlord does not want those people to continue living there. They'd like to move forward and show the property and find other tenants, and would also like to move forward with the eviction. That's sort of the second, maybe third part of this factor, the rights of the landlord, the rights of the tenant. Also, we have to face reality here in Maryland. One of the executive orders, 2 of the executive orders actually, dealt with evictions. There is a temporary moratorium. Evictions are not moving forward. The landlord could file for an eviction, file the paperwork with the court. They're not going to be able to move forward. People are not being evicted right now. There are executive orders that say that, and also there's an administrative order from the Court of Special Appeals as well. The courts are all really operating on crisis mode as well, and really just handling emergency matters, which might be domestic violence or bench warrants or things like that. They're not processing evictions at this point. So I think, like I said, I don't have a definite yes or no answer, which I know a lot of you like. actually, who doesn't like yes and no answers? We all do. At this point in the process, we don't really have a yes or no answer for you. I would say, again, of course, we want the parties to cooperate. If the landlord and tenant can work something out, if the tenant will agree to allow a virtual showing, that might be the best resolution. If not, maybe there's a way to do it in a very limited fashion, like we said, to allow one person in or two people at a time, or something that the tenant could agree with. I guess the worst case scenario from the landlord's perspective is, what if the tenant absolutely refuses, does not want someone to come in through their property? I don't know what would happen if the tenant called the health department. That might be an issue as well. Like we had said, the governor has delegated authority to the local health departments to enforce these executive orders. One situation we heard about, it was in one of the areas of the state where they have a lot of vacation rentals, and someone did call the county health department to complain. It was a vacation rental company. We all know the nosy neighbor. I don't want to disparage any neighbors. We'll say the concerned citizen. We won't say nosy neighbor. We'll say concerned citizen. But someone had called the health department to report that they thought that there were rentals going on, and the health department contacted the owner of the vacation rental company and expressed concerns that the rental company was still continuing to do business as usual and allow short-term rentals. That actually was not what was happening. The person who was in that property actually owned the property. The vacation rental company was not doing short-term rentals. They were operating properly, but that's just one example. If the tenant is concerned or really wants to object, it's possible they could call the county health department, and I'm not sure how the county health department would come down in that kind of situation. It's possible they would side with the tenant. I mean, it is a health crisis and a serious situation. So if anybody else has anything to chime in, please do. I do not have a yes or no answer. I know that we are working on it. All of our departments are working on it. Government Affairs is working on it. Chuck is working on it. There's an attorney listserv for the National Association of Realtors. All of the state attorneys are kind of dealing with this in various ways. And Chuck and the AEs from other states are working on this as well. If anybody, Chuck, Reese or Colette or Mark, anything else you want to add to that?
Well, I was going to say, Kathleen, I'm really glad that you mentioned some of the other partners that we're working with, because a lot of states are dealing with this, and until we have some more guidance, I like what some of the attorneys are saying on NAR's listserv about the tenant and the landlord trying to come up with a workaround. Maybe the landlord asks the tenant to take some images that then can be shared with the landlord and do some kind of virtual tour. That may be, like you said, a good workaround, but we'll just have to hope that we can get some good guidance on that moving forward.
All right. I would just say one other thing. I guess this is sort of contemplating the perfect world where everyone cooperates and works well together, which in reality, that's not generally what we see on the legal hotline, not the kind of questions we get. But in the ideal perfect world where people are cooperating, in all honesty, a lot of tenants are going to have challenges just paying their rent. Yeah. Never mind the virus, whatever it is. A lot of people have lost their jobs or had a significant curtailment of their income. So one thing that a landlord might want to do, if, obviously the landlord, if it's a tenant whose lease extends for another 12 months, 18 months, you want to help that tenant figure out how are they going to get their income back up? How are they going to be able to pay their rent? And that might be an opportunity maybe for the landlord to share resources with the tenant, because there are some programs available at the state level and at the federal level that have expanded unemployment benefits. And there may be ways where the tenants can bring some income, and maybe if the landlord's willing to work with them a little bit, if they're a good tenant who's been there for a while, the landlord wants to keep that tenant, the landlord could maybe share resources with that tenant and help the tenant bring some money in and allow the tenant basically to stay there and to continue to be able to pay rent in some fashion, which I think is a nice transition to Mark's part of the presentation. You were going to talk about state and local programs and I think licensing issues.
Yeah, a little bit. So good afternoon, everyone. Mark Feinroth here. I hope that many of you who are viewing this presentation saw last week's presentation from Bill Castelli and Chuck Caskey about the federal programs and the state programs that are evolving to assist the economic impacts from the virus and the dislocation that's coming about from the shutdowns and the stay-at-home orders from Governor Hogan and the other neighboring governors from states nearby. So I don't want to rehash that. There was also an excellent program just an hour earlier at 1 o'clock this afternoon from the National Realtors. Both of those programs have been recorded and are available for viewing at the National Realtors website, as well as the Maryland Realtors website from Bill and Chuck last week. And Bill and Susan Mitchell put together an excellent one-pager, two-pager document on the benefits that are available at the federal level and at the state level. I will tell you at the Maryland level, the loan programs that are available that came out of the Maryland General Assembly session, those programs are now tapped out. As of Monday evening, that funding is gone. They're no longer accepting applications for the Small Business Emergency Relief Fund at the Maryland level through the Maryland Department of Commerce, or the Small Business Grant Fund program. They're no longer accepting applications for those. That was originally funded at the $75 million level, and there was such a demand for those funds that those funds are largely exhausted at this point. There is the possibility of the Maryland General Assembly going back into session later in the spring. There is talk about that, but there's been no formal announcement about the General Assembly going back into session, and the possibility exists if they do go back into session this spring that they might further fund those programs, have additional funding available, but that's a stay tuned for further development sort of note. There are also local programs available in a few of the larger local counties: Baltimore City, Baltimore County, Montgomery County, Frederick, and Prince George's County all have their own local assistance programs. They've set aside some funding for those. Realtors can take a look at those opportunities as well. And take a look at our one-page, our two-pager that's on the website, the Maryland Realtors website, for the links that go directly to those funds. The key thing that I think many of the realtors are interested in knowing is whether or not the federal Pandemic Unemployment Insurance Fund, the unemployment benefits, are available for 1099 and independent contractors like most real estate agents are. That's the federal program that's being administered by the Maryland Department of Labor Licensing and Regulation. And the answer is yes, independent contractors and 1099 employees are eligible for those programs, but they're telling folks on that website, the DLLR website, not to actually file an application yet. There is an opportunity on that website to go ahead and put your email address in there, where presumably they'll notify you with an application or when their website is updated to provide for an application for 1099 and independent contractors. Unemployment insurance has historically not been available for 1099 employees and independent contractors, so their website wasn't ready when the federal program was extended to those kinds of workers and those kinds of incomes. But there is that opportunity available. The expectation is that in the next week or so, applications will be accepted by DLLR for the Pandemic Unemployment Insurance Fund. And then moving ahead to licensing issues, I think probably all of you are aware that the initial order Governor Hogan made when he declared the emergency regarding coronavirus was that licenses that were expiring during the pendency of the emergency that he was declaring up through, according to DLLR, through May 1st, would be all those licenses that were expiring would be automatically extended. And the licensing expirations that were occurring during that period of time would be further extended depending on when or whether Governor Hogan extended the emergency. So this arbitrary date of May 1st has been set by DLLR on their licenses that apply to all Maryland real estate licenses. The expectation is that they'll be extending that date further. And I think a key consideration for many of our members is what will they do about obtaining continuing education if they're short of their CE hours during this period of time when we can't really congregate and go to continuing education classes live. And the answer is the legal department at Maryland Realtors will be working with the local associations to schedule additional continuing education as soon as the emergency is declared over. So we'll be working with the local associations and get our instructors out, me and Colette and Kathleen and everybody else in the office that teaches continuing education. I think Reese is planning on teaching some in the near future as well. But we'll be scrambling to schedule that as soon as the emergency is declared over and trying to schedule larger classroom sessions so that folks in need of continuing education will be able to obtain it in order to renew their licenses. There are also issues, I think we've all been talking about travel issues about whether or not it's permissible to travel to showings or to take clients to properties to view them in the normal course. And of course, as Kathleen talked about at the front end of the program, real estate is an essential service. It's permissible under the governor's orders to travel to see some of these properties and to travel to a settlement if one is scheduled to conduct a closing on a real estate transaction. The concern that we have and that we want to share with members of the Maryland Realtors is that Governor Hogan has shown a willingness to extend and clarify and make more strict his orders about social distancing and about staying in place. So to the extent that realtors can minimize their travel and minimize their contacts as they're showing properties, that will not mitigate towards the governor making it more difficult to practice real estate and extending an order in a way that might make it more difficult for us to travel. So to try to limit your exposures, try to limit your travel, try to limit your showings in a way that the governor's office isn't hearing complaints about real estate agents showing properties by a nosy neighbor or a concerned citizen or something like that. We're hearing from the governor's office that they get a lot of those calls from folks who are seeing a certain amount of traffic going through homes for sale in given neighborhoods. So be wary of that. It is permissible in Maryland to travel. You don't need any special documentation. The state police colonel who commands the state police, the troopers, has indicated that folks will not be stopped in the normal course of travel unless there's some reason to investigate a particular problem, an automobile accident, some large vehicle with lots of people in it, something like that that would give rise to the trooper wanting to inquire further. They're not simply going to be stopping folks, asking where they're going and if they are going for a permissible purpose under the statute or under the governor's order. And then there are similar travel restrictions and travel permissibilities in Virginia, DC, and Pennsylvania, although Pennsylvania is somewhat more strict. And it's much more difficult if you're traveling to a property in Pennsylvania to be showing properties there. And I think that's pretty much what I plan to cover. Are there questions about any of those kinds of programs? Sandy, you have any questions about that?
Can I just throw one thing in real quick? We had one question. Just if somebody, this was something that was mentioned by Pennsylvania. Obviously, everyone who's listening, all the members, if you are selling a property in Pennsylvania, you have to follow Pennsylvania law. If you're selling a property in DC, you have to follow DC law. Your Maryland law and your Maryland license doesn't cross state lines. So if they have stricter rules in place in the other jurisdictions, West Virginia, whatever it might be, Delaware, comply with the rules and regulations and restrictions that are in place in that jurisdiction. When you're in Maryland, basically you follow the property. Wherever the property is, that's the law that's going to apply.
So Virginia, DC, and Maryland, all three have very similar travel and essential services gubernatorial orders in place. Pennsylvania is somewhat more stringent. I have not checked on Delaware or West Virginia. Any other questions on any of this stuff?
There was a few, I think you pretty much covered it. The CARES Act for unemployment insurance, independent contractor, 1099, one real estate agent. I submitted an email on DLLR to receive details when ready. DLLR does not have details on what documents will be required once we are able to submit the request. Do you know what docs they'll require?
No, we don't. I think DLLR will be following the federal guidance, which is still forthcoming. So the right thing to do was to register your email. They'll, I think, be emailing to folks who registered that they're interested in the 1099 or independent contractor unemployment insurance coverage. I think they'll be emailing an application. And at that point, they'll be requesting particular documentation. But I suspect it's going to be the traditional stuff that you use to file your taxes with. It'll be last year's 1099 and this year's 1099 to demonstrate what your lost income is.
Okay, that's the CARES Act. Have you heard anything about if we get approved for EIDL, that it disqualifies us for unemployment?
So no, there's a certain overlap between the federal programs. the economic injury, I forget the acronym, economic injury EIDL loan is emergency economic injury disaster loan is what the EIDL is. And that's up to a $10,000 loan, but there is a certain amount of overlap with the Paycheck Protection Program, which is also a loan forgiveness program. So the Paycheck Protection Program is largely focused on payroll issues and preserving payroll for the individual, in our case, real estate agent, and any support staff that the real estate agent or broker has. And then the emergency economic injury defense disaster loan is more about working capital. So that's more about things like paid sick leave, rent or mortgage costs, things like that. So it could be a certain amount of overlap between the two. The only prohibition is that you can't double dip. You can't make a request for the same paycheck protection or the same lost income for both programs. You can make separate requests for separate funding for the different funds that you might be dealing with, depending on the nature of your business. If you've got a larger practice with more support staff, that might cover, an office or paid sick leave or rent or mortgage under the disaster loan program versus the payroll protection program. And I think that's going to depend on the individual lenders versus the Small Business Administration, how they're dealing with those applications, and where that's going to be a wait and see sort of program for us as well to kind of learn it as it goes. What else you got, Sandy?
Okay, I think we've kind of covered this one already. Can you please address unemployment benefits for independent contractors?
So yeah, that's kind of I spoke to that a little bit in my remarks, but that's the program that's being administered by the Maryland DLLR, and you go to their website, and if you scroll all the way down to the pandemic unemployment insurance program, pandemic unemployment insurance, there's a place to enter your email address. I urge you to do that, and then they'll be sending out information about how to apply and what documentation is required. And that'll probably be starting April 10th or later.
And these are just a couple of ones that have been, I think Kathleen touched on most of these, but I do have a suggestion for high pressure buyer agents that do not want to follow a seller's request for a virtual tour first and wants to bring a family of 5 through. Seller said no, and the response was extremely rude.
I think the seller's entitled to say no in that situation.
Okay.
Anybody disagree?
No, it's their house still. They can say who can come.
Agreed.
Agreed.
Okay, and tenants are not paying the rent. I heard that you cannot evict now. What can a landlord do? When can you evict them if they don't pay the rent?
Well, what I would suggest, I mean, the landlord basically should take whatever actions they would normally take. If there are notices that need to be sent to the tenant, any letters that need to be sent, the landlord should continue to take those actions and do everything they can and would do in a normal situation. My understanding, I believe, is that they can file the paperwork with the courthouse, but the court is not going to move it forward. The court is really only handling emergency matters, and I don't believe that on the list that I saw from the Court of Special Appeals, landlord-tenant matters were not on that list of emergency matters. So I would suggest the landlord go ahead and take all the actions they would normally take, send the notice, the demand letter, whatever it is, tell the tenant you're in breach of the lease, you need to pay whatever the amount of money is, send all the notices that are required, and then have everything. If you're in a position to go file it, I would say you could file it with the courthouse. I don't believe they're going to take any action. It's basically just going to be however long it takes. And I don't have any crystal ball. I have no way of predicting how long it's going to take. It would have to be until the governor, I guess, rescinds those executive orders, would be when the parties would be able to move forward. And unfortunately, that's from the landlord's perspective, it's unfortunate, but that's where they are.
I heard there was an interesting comment that NAR made. Megan Booth, one of the NAR staffers, talked about the disparity between the length of time that the tenants will have free from threat of eviction versus the amount of time that the owner, landlord, might have on their mortgage, and that they're thinking about seeking additional clarification to give the owner, landlord, more time and potential forgiveness on the mortgage that might be due when they're not getting rent from their tenant who has an extended period of time not to have to pay rent.
Makes sense.
So stay tuned at the federal level. I think there's probably going to be more legislation.
I believe the governor has imposed a moratorium on foreclosures at this time too, at least in Maryland. I don't,
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah, so the courts, I believe, are not accepting notices of intent to foreclose. And again, my understanding is that's going to be the same duration as the tenant relief or whatever this interim basis is until the state of emergency is lifted. So at least here in Maryland, it does not appear that that's an issue. I think the owners of the property are extended. My understanding, unless anyone can correct me, my understanding is the owners are extended the same courtesy as the tenants are at this time, and the foreclosure process would not commence at least while the state of emergency is in place.
That's right.
I believe they can file, but again, it won't move forward.
Okay.
Okay, let's see, just a few more here. I think we answered this one too, but does the COVID-19 addendum cover sellers if they are moving out of state and that state has put in place restrictions for any new rentals?
Well, it would cover any situation in any sort of delay that was caused by COVID-19. And we did kind of broadly define what a COVID-19 delay would look like. So if there's any kind of delay that is the result of this impact of COVID-19, then that I think would come into the purview of the addendum. Kathleen, you agree?
Yeah, I would agree. And I think probably the best thing to do, I mean, I know the new buyer is not going to like this, but do a post-settlement occupancy agreement to allow the sellers to stay in place. They can still go to settlement, I guess, if they wanted to go to settlement. They could do a post-settlement occupancy agreement and allow the seller to stay there, or they could use the COVID addendum to extend the settlement date. Again, it's kind of hard to say if you don't know how long the crisis is going to exist in the other state. It's a little bit of a guessing game to a certain extent, which is not great. But those are two options, I guess. They could extend the settlement date using the COVID-19 addendum, or possibly go to settlement and then utilize a post-settlement occupancy agreement and allow the seller to stay there.
Yes. And Maryland Realtors doesn't have a post-settlement occupancy agreement, but most of the local boards do. So if that is an option, the agents can look to the local board for a post-settlement occupancy agreement.
Any other questions?
Are you coming out with a COVID addendum for entry into a home that buyers need to sign? California has it. It is similar to a hold harmless.
Well, we've been
let go.
we've discussed creating both a COVID-19 addendum to the listing agreement. There's still discussion about that. We've also looked at preparing some kind of hold harmless type agreement. We have been taking a lot of our guidance from the National Association of Realtors attorneys, and there was discussion about from their general counsel on, while it may make the parties feel better to have this kind of hold harmless type agreement in place, the impact of it from a real world perspective may not be much. So we're discussing them. I don't know if the hold harmless agreement will do that. We're still talking about it to see whether or not that's the direction we want to go in. Do you want to add anything to that, Kathleen?
No, I think that's correct. We're looking at information that what other states are doing, some sample forms that other states have done, and as Colette had said, I think with the hold harmless, the guidance or feeling, I guess, from the National Association of Realtors is generally that they're not really pushing that. I'm not sure that this is the weird thing about this virus. I guess it's not going to be so easy to figure out who you caught it from, right? So it's a lot of people are able to spread the virus and they don't even have any symptoms or asymptomatic. So some of the forms, one form that I saw required the parties to sign saying they are not going to spread the virus and they're not going to catch the virus. And in all honesty, I wish it were that easy. We all would sign it and the problem would be over, but it's not realistic. So we're looking at it and we're looking into it. If any of you guys have language that you love or a form that you love, share it with us. We've seen all the state forms. We have access to those, I believe. But if you have some suggestion or something you think would work, you certainly can share it with us. We're absolutely willing to look at it. Right now, we're still examining it and we're looking at it, as Colette had said.
Yeah.
Okay. Can a tenant whose lease ends May 31st blatantly say that they will block any showings?
That's kind of back to we did kind of talk about that. I think right now that we are looking for additional guidance on that. That's right now. What's the date today? April 8th.
Yeah, April 8th.
May 31st. So there's a certain amount of time there that maybe they can let this simmer for a bit. Maybe they don't need to resolve this today. But right as of this second, I think we're seeking additional guidance. Other states are dealing with this as well. Some states have said point blank the tenant would have the right to say that. While this is going on, the tenant could say, no, I will not allow any showings. Maryland has not said that. The governor has not said that. The executive orders do not say that. But again, we're trying to get guidance and work with our other, industry partners to come to some kind of understanding that balances the interest of the landlord. They want to show the property, they want to sell the property, they want to rent it again, but also values the position of the tenants who may not want to have strangers in their property. Maybe there's someone who's at risk in that household or in that family, and they may not be comfortable allowing strangers into the property. And there's, to the best of my knowledge, there haven't been any court cases yet to adjudicate whether that is reasonable for the tenant to say, no, I'm not going to allow someone into the property, or whether that is unreasonable. I think this is obviously a very hot topic. It's developing right now as we're speaking. So as guidance becomes available, we'll certainly share it. We'll, modify our guidance or update our FAQs or possibly do an addendum or something to some of our forms if that type of information becomes more clear.
Yeah, and Kathleen, as you said, with the order coming into place that the health department can come out, if a tenant, who knows how they're going to come out on that. If a tenant says, look, I have, somebody legally in here, my mother who's sick or whatever, but, we can't predict how the health department would conclude or decide in that kind of scenario. So it's something that all the states are dealing with right now.
Okay. See, I think we have two more. There's a lot of almost some of the repeat ones, but are landlords extending leases, which set to end May 31st? Would a 6-month no rent increase be a good option to offer? And would a slight increase for a 1-year extension be frowned upon?
That's a nice question to receive. If a landlord wants to extend someone's lease, I think that's a great option. In general, it's nice for the landlord. It's a steady stream of income. Even if they keep the rent at the current amount or just increase it slightly, they're not going to have a month where the property is vacant. So probably overall, that's to their economic advantage, especially in this time of uncertainty. I think from the tenant's perspective, if the tenant wants to stay, I think that seems like a win-win, in all honesty. Can they extend it for 12 months or 18 months? Was that the?
It said, would a 6-month no rent increase be a good option to offer? And would a slight increase for a 1-year extension be frowned upon?
I don't, not to the best of my knowledge. I think those sound like great ideas. Anybody have a disagree with that? I think that's a terrific option. I'm glad that the landlord is flexible and willing to do that. And 6 months with no rent increase, the tenant, I would assume, would have no objection to that either. So that seems, like I said, that seems like a win-win to me.
And try to get past the virus period, the
Right.
emergency period, and
Yeah.
deal with showings under a more flexible sort of period when there's no virus emergency to worry about.
And I would say if you're going to increase the rent, you just want to make sure you give the proper notice for that. That would just make sure that you do that.
And we'll get to the last one here. Any chance of a Zoom approval for CE?
Unfortunately for the CE regulations don't permit that kind of process. It's possible that the Real Estate Commission will look at these circumstances related to the virus emergency and consider revising those regulations. But right now, the Real Estate Commission doesn't have much latitude in allowing for distance learning by Zoom or any of the other platforms to do the mandatory CE, those 15 hours required for agents.
Mark, I would say, I think the Real Estate Commission, I believe, has allowed video, Zoom, whatever it might be, for pre-licensing classes.
Right.
I think that's right now where we are pre-licensing classes. They've been a little bit more flexible with that. But as Mark had pointed out, not with CE that we are all required to take. Again, I think the thought process is hopefully this is going to be a short-term crisis, a relatively short-term crisis. This state of emergency is going to last, I don't know, let's just say another 30 days, fingers crossed. And then we'll be back to normal-ish. So at that point, I think, remember, the governor extended the renewal date for people's licenses, and everyone is going to have till 30 days after the state of emergency is lifted to complete their CE. So I think right now the thought is we should be able to continue to offer CE and take CE in the way that we've been doing it. I guess if this goes out much longer than that, then maybe they'll reconsider that or revisit that. But at this point, I don't think there's any plans to do that.
Right. So there is provision in the Real Estate Commission's regs to do distance learning, but not by a Zoom lecture sort of a platform. They can do distance learning, and they have approved distance learning classes that are specifically content-based and require, the student taking the class to answer questions as they go through, to ensure that the student's really there and paying attention to the content and digesting the content, rather than just setting up a Zoom conference and walking away from the computer. That was always Real Estate Commission's concern, was always that they were worried about licensees walking away from the computer after logging on and not paying attention to the class.
I have one more question just came in. I have a seller who settles on the sale of their property next week and have a post-occupancy agreement, but want/need to extend it because they don't have any place to go in the interim. Older sellers, one with a health issue. Can we force the buyer to extend the rent back?
Whatever force the buyers to extend the rent back. I mean, whatever the parties agree to in the post-settlement occupancy agreement is what's binding. Any changes any request to change that seems to me would have to be agreed to by both parties in writing.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Colette. They can't force the other party to agree. So whatever, if they can't reach an agreement and agree to extend it, then whatever they've agreed to now is what's going to be binding.
Right.
Okay. I don't believe I have any more questions. I don't see anything currently coming up on Facebook.
Okay. I guess we'll say we'll wrap it up then. If anybody, I guess, make a comment if you guys thought this was helpful. We're all hanging out at home. We could do this every week if you want, or we could do it again. I won't say we'll do it every week, but let us know if this was helpful, if you would like us to do this again, or if there's any other topic that you want us to focus on, maybe do another Facebook Live event, spend an hour and a half talking about whatever hot topic you might have. So just let us know. Thanks for listening. And stay safe, stay healthy. Thanks, you guys.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.